I was trained to believe the enemy would break if pressed hard enough. From behind wire and routine paperwork, I watched a system that did not bend. The orders I had trusted no longer explained what I could see every day. What failed first was not our weapons, but our understanding. By the spring of 1944, the United States had been at war for more than 2 years. Its armed forces were deployed across two vast and separate theaters: the Atlantic world, where preparations were underway for a major landing in Western Europe, and the Pacific, where island campaigns were advancing toward Japan. The logistical demands of these operations were unprecedented in scale and complexity. They required the sustained movement of troops, fuel, ammunition, food, and industrial output across oceans that were thousands of miles apart. At the same time, within the continental United States, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war were being held in camps scattered across the country. Most had been captured in North Africa, the Mediterranean, or at sea. They were housed far from the front lines, often in rural or desert locations, and employed in agricultural or maintenance labor under the terms of the Geneva Convention. These camps were designed to be orderly, secure, and deliberately distant from centers of military production. The prisoners were not meant to see the war as it was being waged beyond the perimeter fences. Yet some did. One such camp was Camp Papago Park, located just east of Phoenix, Arizona. Established in 1943, it held several thousand German and Italian prisoners, many of them from the Afrika Korps or from naval units captured in the Atlantic. The camp sat near major rail lines that connected the American Southwest to ports on the Pacific coast and to industrial centers farther east. Trains passed within sight and sound of the compound day and night. Among the prisoners was a German naval warrant officer assigned to clerical duties within the camp. His pre-war service had been administrative rather than operational. He had worked with shipping manifests, fuel allocations, and port schedules, and he understood the rhythms of large-scale transport. At Papago Park, his role was minor, maintaining internal work rosters, inventory and camp supplies, and recording labor assignments. It was routine work, repetitive, and largely detached from the fighting he had left behind. From his desk near the camp's administrative buildings, he could hear the trains. They ran on fixed schedules with little variation. Long freight consists moved westward toward California ports. Others moved east, heavy with equipment returning inland. The traffic did not diminish with seasons or weather. There were no long pauses, no extended gaps that might suggest disruption or strain. The trains came through at all hours, often in close succession. At first, these observations were casual. The prisoners talked among themselves about home, about the progress of the war as reported in censored newspapers, and about rumors passed from camp to camp. Like many Axis servicemen, they had been raised on assumptions about American industrial limits. The United States, they believed, would be formidable in one theater, but would struggle to sustain major operations in two. Distance alone seemed an insurmountable obstacle. The Pacific was too far. Europe was too demanding. Something, it was assumed, would have to give way. The clerical officer did not immediately challenge these assumptions. His early months in captivity were occupied with adaptation, managing shortages of familiar items and adjusting to a life structured by regulations written in another language. But over time, patterns became difficult to ignore. The camp received regular deliveries of food and equipment, often in quantities that exceeded immediate need. Warehouses were stocked generously, and replacements arrived before items were fully worn. Fuel supplies for camp vehicles were steady, even as newspapers reported rationing for civilians. Medical facilities were maintained without apparent interruption. None of this suggested an economy under severe strain. More telling were the newspapers themselves. Though censored, they carried reports of simultaneous operations, amphibious landings in the Pacific alongside heavy bombing campaigns over Germany, convoy battles in the Atlantic reported in the same columns as advances in New Guinea or the Central Pacific. These were not isolated actions spaced carefully apart. They were concurrent. For a trained administrator, concurrency mattered. It implied not just ambition, but capacity. Within the camp, informal discussions among prisoners reflected growing unease.
Some officers dismissed the evidence, attributing it to propaganda or selective reporting. Others argued that appearances were deceptive, that the visible abundance masked underlying fragility. But the clerical officer began to compare what he read with what he heard and saw. Rail movements, for example, followed a logic that suggested coordination across regions. Westbound trains carrying crated vehicles, fuel tanks, and packaged supplies were often matched by eastbound trains bearing raw materials or repaired equipment. The volume was consistent with sustained output, not emergency surges. The absence of visible bottlenecks was notable. The officer began keeping informal notes, not as intelligence gathering, there was no mechanism to transmit this information, but as a way to impose order on his observations. He marked approximate train lengths, times of passage, and direction. He compared these with shipping reports mentioned in the press. Over weeks, then months, the data accumulated. What emerged was not a precise picture, but a clear trend. The United States was not choosing between oceans, it was servicing both. This realization stood in quiet contrast to the doctrine many of the prisoners had been taught. German naval planning before the war had assumed that the United States mobilization would be slow and politically constrained. Even after entry into the conflict, it was believed that the United States would prioritize one theater decisively while limiting commitments elsewhere. The idea of sustained, high-intensity operations in both the Atlantic and Pacific was often treated as theoretical rather than practical. Yet the evidence at Papago Park suggested otherwise. The clerical officer's role in the camp remained unchanged. He filed reports, issued tools, and tracked labor details. There were no dramatic confrontations or overt acts of defiance. But in conversations with a small circle of fellow prisoners, men with backgrounds in logistics, engineering, or staff work, he began to raise questions. How were the Americans allocating shipping tonnage? How were they avoiding congestion at ports? How were they training crews fast enough to man the vessels implied by the traffic? These were technical questions, not ideological ones. They reflected professional concern rather than admiration. The answers, when they came, were indirect. A camp guard mentioned working briefly at a West Coast port before being reassigned. He spoke casually about round-the-clock loading operations and standardized procedures that minimized delays. Another guard referenced relatives employed in factories producing identical components at scale. None of this was classified information. It was simply the lived experience of a society mobilized comprehensively. Gradually, the officer recognized a limitation in his own side's assessments. Axis planning had emphasized decisive engagements and technological superiority. Less attention had been paid to administrative resilience and redundancy. The ability to absorb losses, reroute supplies, and continue operations without visible disruption had been underestimated. This was not a sudden revelation, nor did it lead to immediate conclusions about the outcome of the war. But it introduced doubt where certainty had once existed. If the United States could maintain this level of activity across two oceans simultaneously, then assumptions about exhaustion and overextension required reconsideration. By mid-1944, as reports of Allied landings in France reached the camp, the trains continued to pass Papago Park without interruption. Pacific operations intensified rather than slowed. There was no evidence of a strategic pause. For the clerical officer, the routine of captivity now carried an added weight. Each day's ordinary tasks were accompanied by an awareness that the war beyond the wire was unfolding according to patterns his training had not fully prepared him to expect. The discrepancy between doctrine and observation had not yet resolved into a clear understanding. It remained an open problem, one that would continue to assert itself as events progressed. At this stage, there were no conclusions to record, only inconsistencies to note and questions to hold in reserve. The limits of American capacity, long assumed to be fixed, appeared less certain than before. The implications of that uncertainty were still forming.
By the summer of 1944, the operational tempo of the war increased rather than stabilized. Allied forces were fully engaged in Western Europe following the landings in Normandy, while in the Pacific, American units advanced through the Mariana Islands and prepared for further operations toward the Philippines. These developments were reflected, indirectly but persistently, in the flow of information and material visible from within Axis prisoner of war camps in the United States. At Camp Papago Park, the daily routine remained largely unchanged. Prisoners rose early, assembled for roll call, and were assigned to work details that included maintenance, kitchen duties, and agricultural labor outside the camp perimeter. Guards were consistent in their enforcement of regulations. Conditions were firm but generally compliant with international standards. Nothing about the camp itself suggested strain or emergency. What changed was the scale of activity beyond it. Rail traffic increased noticeably during the latter half of the year. Freight trains grew longer, with more frequent double-heading locomotives required to move heavy loads across desert grades. The intervals between trains shortened. Movements continued uninterrupted even during periods of extreme heat when mechanical failure might normally be expected to disrupt schedules. The German clerical officer continued to observe these developments with professional interest. He was not alone. Other prisoners with naval or staff backgrounds began to comment on the persistence of supply flows. The earlier belief that American production would peak and then plateau no longer aligned with what they could verify through observation. Newspapers, though still censored, now carried reports that were difficult to reconcile with Axis expectations. In Europe, Allied forces were pushing inland despite significant losses. In the Pacific, naval engagements involved carrier task forces operating far from established bases. The language of the reports suggested continuity, not crisis management. Within the camp, arguments became more frequent. Some officers insisted that American successes were temporary and that the strain of global operations would soon reveal itself. They pointed to the difficulty of sustaining manpower, the complexity of coordinating multinational forces, and the inevitability of political fatigue. Others, including the clerical officer, began to see these explanations as increasingly speculative. He returned repeatedly to the same question: how was the United States avoiding the breakdowns that had plagued Axis logistics? The answer, insofar as it could be inferred, lay not in any single innovation, but in accumulation. American procedures favored standardization over specialization. Equipment types were fewer, interchangeable parts more common. Training programs emphasized repetition and scalability rather than elite selectivity. Losses were replaced through systems designed for volume. This ran counter to much of German and Japanese doctrine, which valued precision, technical refinement, and tightly controlled command structures. Those systems performed well under optimal conditions, but proved brittle when disrupted. Evidence of this contrast emerged even within the camp's internal operations. Supplies arrived with predictable regularity. Administrative errors were corrected quickly. Replacement guards and personnel rotated through without noticeable gaps. These were minor indicators, but taken together, they pointed to institutional depth. The clerical officer began to recognize a broader pattern. American operations were designed to tolerate inefficiency at the local level without compromising overall output. Redundancy was not treated as waste, but as insurance. For prisoners trained in more centralized systems, this was unsettling. It suggested that even successful interdiction efforts, such as U-boat campaigns or attacks on shipping, might impose losses without achieving decisive effects. The system absorbed damage and continued. As the year progressed, the limitations of Axis assumptions became harder to dismiss. Reports filtered into the camp of failed German counterattacks in France and increasing Allied air superiority over the Reich. Simultaneously, Pacific battles showed American forces maintaining pressure despite extended supply lines. The clerical officer noted that none of these developments were accompanied by signs of American retrenchment. There were no visible reallocations that suggested one theater was being sacrificed for another. On the contrary, the scale of operations appeared to grow. This realization introduced tension among the prisoners. Official doctrine, reinforced through years of training and propaganda, held that the enemy would eventually exhaust himself. Yet the observable evidence contradicted this expectation. The gap between belief and reality widened. Some prisoners withdrew from discussion.
Others doubled down on ideological explanations, attributing American success to temporary advantages or moral weakness that would ultimately prove decisive. The clerical officer adopted a different posture. He treated the discrepancy as a technical problem, one that required reassessment rather than denial. He revisited his informal notes and expanded them, organizing observations by category: transportation, production indicators, personnel turnover. He compared these against known Axis constraints: fuel shortages, limited shipbuilding capacity, and bottlenecks in training pipelines. The contrast was stark. At no point did he imagine that these insights would alter his own circumstances. As a prisoner, he had no authority, no means of communication with decision-makers, and no expectation of release before the war's end. The exercise was intellectual rather than practical. It was an attempt to understand how established frameworks had failed to anticipate the present situation. Occasionally, conversations with American personnel reinforced his conclusions. Guards spoke openly about relatives working in factories or shipyards, often in different regions. They described production schedules that ran continuously, with shifts replacing one another without pause. There was little sense of improvisation. The system appeared planned for endurance. This contrasted sharply with the officers' memories of wartime Germany, where production increases were often reactive and constrained by resource shortages. There, efficiency depended heavily on minimizing loss. In the American case, loss appeared anticipated and accommodated. By late 1944, the camp received new prisoners captured in Europe. Their accounts, though limited, confirmed that Allied forces showed no sign of logistical hesitation. Units were re-equipped rapidly, damaged vehicles were replaced, air support remained constant. These testimonies carried particular weight. They came from men who had faced American forces directly, not from newspapers or rumor. Their descriptions aligned with what the clerical officer had inferred from afar. The cumulative effect was a growing acknowledgement among a minority of prisoners that Axis planning had misjudged the nature of American power. It was not simply industrial capacity, but organizational philosophy. The United States had built a system optimized for sustained parallel operations rather than decisive concentration. This understanding did not resolve into a clear prediction of defeat. Wars were complex, and outcomes depended on many variables, but it undermined confidence in doctrines that assumed the enemy's limits were closer than they appeared. As 1944 drew to a close, winter did not slow the movement of trains past Papago Park. Pacific operations continued despite weather challenges. European fighting intensified rather than paused. For the clerical officer, the problem had shifted. The question was no longer whether the United States could fight across two oceans simultaneously. The evidence suggested that it already was. The unresolved issue was how Axis command structures would respond to this reality, given doctrines that left little room for adaptation. The tension between observed capability and official expectation remained unresolved, setting the stage for decisions and reassessments that would follow as the war entered its final phase.
By early 1945, the strategic situation of the Axis powers had deteriorated sharply. In Europe, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into the German heartland. In the Pacific, American operations had reached Iwo Jima, with preparations underway for further assaults closer to Japan. These developments were reflected in the content of prisoner-of-war newspapers and in the steady movement of materiel visible across the American interior. At Camp Papago Park, the clerical officer's daily responsibilities continued without interruption. He maintained supply ledgers, supervised work details, and ensured compliance with camp regulations. His position afforded him limited authority, but steady access to information flows within the camp. By this point in the war, his observations were no longer casual, they had become systematic. The turning point in his understanding did not come from a single event, but from accumulation. Over time, the discrepancy between Axis assumptions and American performance had grown too large to ignore. The evidence no longer supported the idea that the United States was merely coping with a difficult situation.
It suggested that American systems had been deliberately designed to sustain concurrent operations across vast distances. This realization carried personal implications. Before capture, the officer had accepted without question the planning frameworks taught within the German Navy. These emphasized calculated risk, concentrated effort, and the expectation that an industrial opponent would falter under sufficient pressure. The U-boat campaign in particular had been premised on the belief that shipping losses would outpace replacement and force a strategic reckoning. From captivity, it became clear that this reckoning had not occurred. Shipping losses were reported, but replacement figures followed close behind. New ship classes appeared in rapid succession, convoy systems adapted, ports expanded rather than contracted. The officer recognized that these were not improvisations, but features of a system built for adaptation. The unofficial adjustment, then, was internal. He revised his own understanding of the war's mechanics, independent of doctrine or propaganda. This was not an act of defiance, nor did it involve communication with American authorities. It was a professional recalibration, conducted privately and cautiously. Risk entered the equation through conversation. Within the camp, discussions among prisoners were monitored, if not formally recorded. Open expressions of defeatism were discouraged by senior Axis officers, who maintained internal discipline and sought to preserve morale. Questioning established doctrine, especially in a manner that implied structural failure, could lead to social isolation or disciplinary action within the prisoner community. The clerical officer became more selective about whom he spoke with. He confined detailed discussions to a small circle of men with similar backgrounds in logistics and administration. Even then, he framed his observations as technical curiosities rather than conclusions. This caution reflected an understanding of the camp's social dynamics rather than fear of American reprisal. Despite these constraints, the conversations deepened. One recurring topic was the American approach to redundancy. The officer noted that multiple supply routes existed for the same objective. Rail lines overlapped, ports were duplicated, production facilities were geographically dispersed. Disruption in one area did not halt operations elsewhere. This stood in contrast to Axis systems, where critical nodes often represented single points of failure. Another topic was manpower. American training pipelines appeared capable of replacing losses without reducing operational tempo. Units rotated, rested, and returned to combat. This suggested not only numerical strength, but administrative foresight. These discussions marked a departure from earlier debates about willpower or ideology. They focused instead on structure and process. The implication was that the war's outcome was being shaped as much by organizational design as by battlefield performance. The officer's internal reassessment extended to his own role before capture. He revisited past reports and assumptions, recognizing how certain indicators had been discounted or misinterpreted. Shipping figures that seemed manageable in isolation now appeared inadequate when viewed against American replacement capacity. Intelligence assessments that emphasized short-term disruption had failed to account for systemic resilience. This was not an exercise in self-reproach. It was an attempt to understand how professional judgment had been constrained by institutional frameworks. The realization that doctrine could obscure reality rather than clarify it was unsettling. External confirmation arrived intermittently. New prisoners captured in Europe during the final months of fighting brought first-hand accounts of American logistics at the front. They described supply dumps that extended for miles, repair units that restored damaged equipment rapidly, and an abundance of transport vehicles. These accounts were consistent across units and locations, suggesting standardized practice rather than exceptional circumstance. The clerical officer integrated these reports into his broader assessment. They reinforced the conclusion that American capacity was not merely holding steady, but expanding even as the war approached its climax. At this stage, the risk was not physical, but intellectual. To accept this interpretation meant acknowledging that the war had been lost not only through tactical defeat, but through systemic misjudgment. For an officer trained within a culture that prized doctrinal coherence, this was a difficult admission. Yet the evidence left little alternative. The officer did not attempt to persuade others beyond his limited circle. He understood that such efforts would be futile and potentially disruptive. Instead, he focused on documenting his observations with greater rigor, organizing them into comparative frameworks that contrasted Axis and American approaches. This documentation was informal and incomplete. It was written on scraps of paper and in margins of permitted notebooks. There was no expectation that it would survive the war. Its purpose was analytical rather than archival. As Allied forces closed in on Germany and Japan faced increasing isolation, the officer's perspective shifted from analysis of enemy capability to reflection on institutional response. How would Axis command structures interpret these developments? Would they adapt, or would they adhere to assumptions that no longer held? From captivity, there was no way to know. What was clear was that the American system continued to function without visible hesitation. Even as victory approached, there was no sign of demobilization or complacency. Production remained high, transport networks remained active, training continued. This persistence challenged the notion that American effort was driven solely by crisis. It suggested a commitment to sustaining capacity until objectives were fully secured. For the officer, this marked the point at which understanding replaced uncertainty. The question of whether the United States could fight across two oceans simultaneously was answered by observation. The remaining uncertainty concerned how such a system would shape the post-war world and whether lessons drawn from its performance would be acknowledged by those who had underestimated it. As the war entered its final months, the officer's unofficial adjustment, his recalibrated understanding of American power, remained a private conclusion. It had not altered his circumstances, but it had altered his interpretation of events. The risk he had taken was internal, challenging assumptions ingrained over years of service. The implications of that challenge, however, would extend beyond the wire, into the reckoning that followed the war's end.
In the final months of the war, the consequences of earlier assumptions became increasingly visible, even from within captivity. By April 1945, German resistance in Europe was collapsing. American and Allied forces advanced with a speed that left little room for organized withdrawal. In the Pacific, preparations for further operations continued alongside ongoing combat, despite heavy casualties. At Camp Papago Park, the prisoner population began to change. Senior German officers were separated for administrative reasons. New prisoners arrived less frequently, and rumors of surrender circulated with greater intensity. The camp's internal hierarchy, once rigid, softened as the inevitability of defeat became harder to deny. For the clerical officer, this period brought a new form of tension. His revised understanding of the war's mechanics, once a private analytical exercise, now intersected with the camp's shifting social and psychological landscape. Within the prisoner community, explanations for defeat were being actively contested. Some officers attributed the outcome to overwhelming numbers alone. Others pointed to strategic errors by political leadership. A smaller group acknowledged deeper structural problems but resisted articulating them clearly. The idea that American systems had outperformed Axis doctrine at an institutional level was particularly uncomfortable. When the clerical officer raised such points, even cautiously, he encountered resistance. Senior prisoners reminded him that doctrine existed for a reason and that outcomes were shaped by many variables beyond logistics. Others warned that excessive analysis served no purpose in captivity and risked undermining cohesion. These responses were not hostile, but they were firm. There were limits to what could be said without challenging collective identity. This pushback marked a shift from earlier months when debate had been tolerated as theoretical. Now, as defeat became imminent, interpretations carried emotional weight. Acknowledging systemic misjudgment threatened narratives that preserved professional dignity. The officer responded by withdrawing further from discussion. He confined his observations to written notes and limited exchanges with those already inclined toward analytical reassessment. This retreat was not born of fear, but of recognition that the camp environment no longer supported detached evaluation. Meanwhile, external developments continued to reinforce his conclusions.
News of Germany's surrender reached the camp in May 1945. It was delivered formally by American authorities and confirmed by subsequent reports. Prisoners were required to acknowledge the end of hostilities in Europe. The reaction varied. Some expressed relief. Others responded with silence. A few disputed the terms or questioned the permanency of the situation. In the Pacific, the war continued. American operations intensified rather than paused, even as European fighting ceased. This continuation was significant. It demonstrated that American capacity had not been fully consumed by the European campaign. Resources were redirected, but not stretched to exhaustion. From the camp, this was visible in the same ways as before. Rail traffic remained heavy, supply deliveries continued on schedule, and administrative routines showed no sign of contraction. Demobilization was not immediate. The system adjusted, but it did not unravel. For the clerical officer, this phase underscored the durability of the structures he had been observing. The end of one major theater did not overwhelm the transition to focus on another. Instead, the shift appeared managed and deliberate. This realization carried professional consequences. As surrender documents were processed and prisoners prepared for eventual repatriation, American authorities conducted interviews to assess background and expertise. The clerical officer's administrative experience was noted, though it did not result in special treatment. However, it placed him in contact with American officers responsible for camp logistics and processing. These interactions were formal and limited, but they offered indirect insight. Procedures were standardized, paperwork flowed through multiple redundant channels, errors were corrected methodically, there was little improvisation even in the administrative handling of former enemies. The contrast with Axis end-of-war disorganization was stark. Within the prisoner community, the officer observed a gradual reassessment of earlier beliefs. Conversations shifted from justification to explanation. The question was no longer how victory had been lost, but why assumptions about the enemy had proven so inaccurate. In these discussions, the officer's earlier observations found a more receptive audience. With the immediate need to preserve morale gone, there was greater willingness to consider structural explanations. Logistics, production philosophy, and organizational culture entered the conversation. Still, resistance remained. Not all prisoners were prepared to accept that doctrine itself had been flawed. Some framed American success as an anomaly enabled by geography and resources rather than planning. Others emphasized that no system was perfect and that different circumstances might have produced different outcomes. The officer did not press the point. He understood that institutional self-examination was uneven and often incomplete. His role was not to persuade but to observe. As preparations for repatriation progressed, he organized his notes more carefully. He reduced them to concise comparisons, stripping away speculation and focusing on observable differences. He did not know whether his notes would survive transport home or whether they would ever be read by others. What mattered at this stage was clarity. The war had demonstrated that the United States could sustain large-scale military operations across two oceans simultaneously, not through extraordinary measures, but through systems designed for scale, redundancy, and adaptation. This capability had not been fully appreciated by Axis planners, who had operated under different assumptions about efficiency and control. The officer's earlier internal adjustment now appeared less controversial and more descriptive. It aligned with outcomes that were no longer in dispute. As the camp transitioned from a wartime holding facility to a staging area for return, the officer recognized that his professional education had been incomplete. It had emphasized doctrine without adequately accounting for the enemy's institutional character. This was not a failure of individual judgment alone, but of a system that prioritized theoretical coherence over empirical reassessment. The implications of this realization would not be immediate. They would unfold gradually, shaped by post-war conditions, professional reintegration, and the broader effort to understand how the war had been fought and lost. For now, the officer remained within the wire, awaiting transport, his observations complete, but their reception uncertain. The system he had studied from afar continued to operate with quiet efficiency, even as the conflict drew to a close.
By the late summer of 1945, the war had ended in both theaters. Germany had surrendered unconditionally in May, and Japan followed in August after sustained American operations and the collapse of its strategic position. For the Axis prisoners held in the United States, the conflict was over not through gradual disengagement, but by formal declaration. The camps shifted from wartime custody to transitional processing centers, tasked with documentation, health screening, and preparation for repatriation. At Camp Papago Park, routines changed incrementally. Guard strength was reduced, work details were reorganized, educational and vocational programs expanded, intended to occupy prisoners during the waiting period before transport. The atmosphere was quieter, less tense. The urgency that had shaped daily life during the war receded. For the German clerical officer, this period offered distance, both temporal and psychological, from the assumptions that had guided his earlier service. With defeat no longer hypothetical, analysis became less defensive. The question was no longer how the war might still be won, but how it had been fought. His notes, accumulated over months of observation, were now complete. They contained no revelations, no secret data, and no dramatic conclusions. They documented patterns, sustained rail movement, consistent supply levels, administrative redundancy, and the absence of visible strain even during peak operations. Taken together, they described a system capable of maintaining simultaneous global commitments. Before repatriation, prisoners were permitted to retain a limited number of personal papers. The clerical officers selected his notes carefully, condensing them further to ensure they would pass inspection. He did not frame them as criticism or intelligence, but as technical observations. There was no attempt to conceal their content. The camp authorities showed little interest. The war was over, and such matters no longer carried immediate relevance. The journey home took weeks. Prisoners were moved by rail to coastal ports, then transported by ship across the Atlantic. During transit, conversations among former officers continued, now stripped of urgency. Many revisited earlier debates with greater openness. Accounts from different camps aligned. Men who had been held in the Midwest described similar rail traffic and industrial activity. Those detained near ports recalled constant loading operations and standardized procedures. The shared conclusion, though rarely stated explicitly, was clear. American power had not rested on improvisation or singular advantage, but on a system designed to operate at scale for extended periods. It had not required extraordinary effort to fight across two oceans. It had been structured to do so. Upon return to Germany, the officer encountered a society in disarray. Infrastructure was damaged, institutions dismantled, and professional pathways uncertain. Former officers faced scrutiny, denazification processes, and the challenge of reintegration into civilian life. In this environment, detailed analysis of wartime logistics held little immediate value. Yet over time, as military and administrative institutions were rebuilt under new frameworks, questions about past failures resurfaced. Training programs emphasized different priorities. Centralization was reassessed. Flexibility and redundancy, once viewed as inefficiencies, were reconsidered as safeguards. The officer's observations did not shape policy directly. He held no influential position, published no major work, and did not seek public attention. His role in the post-war period was modest. But within professional circles, particularly among those tasked with rebuilding administrative capacity, similar conclusions emerged independently. American records, once accessible, confirmed what had been inferred from afar. Production figures, shipping logs, and training outputs demonstrated the scale and consistency of effort. The ability to conduct major operations in Europe while sustaining an expansive Pacific campaign was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate organizational choices made before and during the war. In this context, the experience of Axis prisoners in the United States acquired retrospective significance. From their constrained vantage point, they had observed aspects of American capacity that were less visible at the front.
They had seen the interior mechanisms of a system at work, unmasked by propaganda or battlefield chaos. For the clerical officer, this understanding became part of a broader professional lesson. Doctrine, he concluded, must be tested continuously against observable reality. Assumptions about an adversary's limits require constant revision. Systems should be evaluated not only for efficiency under ideal conditions, but for resilience under sustained pressure. These conclusions were not dramatic. They did not lend themselves to slogans or simplified narratives. They belonged instead to the quiet domain of administrative learning, where failures are often recognized only after outcomes are irreversible. The legacy of these observations was similarly understated. There were no monuments or official acknowledgments. The lesson was absorbed gradually, diffused across institutions rather than attributed to individuals. It informed post-war thinking about logistics, planning, and organizational design without being traced to specific moments of realization. In the decades that followed, the Second World War would be remembered for its battles, leaders, and decisive events. Less attention would be paid to the administrative endurance that made those events possible. Yet within that endurance lay a critical factor: the capacity to fight across two oceans simultaneously without systemic collapse. For those who had doubted this possibility, sometimes until the evidence became unavoidable, the realization came not through dramatic confrontation, but through routine observation. Trains passing on schedule, warehouses stocked, procedures followed, systems holding. The war ended and the world moved on. But the quiet recognition formed behind barbed wire remained, a reminder that outcomes are often shaped long before they are visible on the battlefield. If you value carefully researched World War II stories that focus on overlooked perspectives and quiet realities, consider supporting the channel so these histories continue to be told.